right. We begin this morning with our study of Colossians. And we might even get to the text this morning. I don't know. That's I'm going to say doubtful, but maybe we'll get to the first couple of verses. But what I'm going to do, as I always do when I begin a letter, particularly I want to introduce it. And I say all the time, you've been in my classes, you know I say that introduction is not filler. I'm not saying this just because I don't have anything else to say. This is important because when you and I are studying the Bible, like studying a letter like Colossians, we are in essence reading somebody else's mail. We are in the, because the way God, of course, Scripture is God's Word and His message to us. But the way we hear that message is hearing correctly what God said to the Colossians through Paul. Once we hear that correctly, we're then in a position to hear what is God saying to us today through what He said to the Colossians. So it's important that we get that on straight, and hearing and understanding what Paul is saying to the Colossians, to hear that correctly, we need to know something of the circumstances. And so it helps us because we in essence have one side of a conversation. And so the more we understand about the situation, the setting, the time, the culture, all of that, it helps us in hearing correctly what is the message of Colossians. Now, some of this I want to talk about first the authorship, and you may say, why do that? It's obviously by Paul. I agree it's by Paul. But this is one of the letters that are contested. So I want to say a little bit about the authorship. The letter says it's from the Apostle Paul, and it contains many personal references and details which reinforce that identification that it's written by the Apostle Paul, including the declaration in chapter 4, verse 18, the greeting is by my hand, Paul's. Then he says, remember my chains. Now, no early Christians doubted Paul's authorship of the letter. And there was no controversy at all over Colossians' acceptance into the Christian canon. In other words, being accepted as authoritative, Spirit-inspired. There was no debate about that. In fact, Donald Guthrie, in his New Testament introduction, he says, there is no shred of evidence that the Pauline authorship of the whole or any part of this epistle was ever disputed until the 19th century. Okay, so that's significant. That's telling us something. Nevertheless, you have many modern scholars, they argue against Pauline authorship. They're claiming that the language and the style and the teaching differs from that of Paul. They assert that some later disciple who considered himself an authoritative interpreter of Paul, that this later disciple, he adopted the persona of Paul in keeping with an allegedly recognized literary convention. He did this in order to extend or to develop Paul's thought. In other words, they're claiming he wasn't trying to deceive anyone. He adopted this persona of Paul pursuant to an understood literary convention, so everybody would understand he's not pretending to be Paul. He's adopting Paul's persona to make a point, to extend Paul's teaching. So that's the idea and the claim. But even if that were the case, even if there was in the first century an accepted literary convention for a personal letter like this, in other words, this very personal letter that you had examples of personal letters like this where someone adopted a literary persona. Even if we had that, which is doubtful, okay? But even if that were the case, there's zero evidence that a letter written by someone in the name of an apostle would have been accepted as authoritative by the church. Okay, so even if you had that, which is doubtful for this kind of letter, you do have examples of pseudonymity on something else, but on this kind of personal letter, that's doubtful. But if you did, would the church accept it as authoritative? There's no evidence of that at all. On the contrary, Serapion, fellow who was a bishop of Antioch around AD 200, as Moo says, he seems to represent the universal viewpoint of the early church on the issue of pseudepigraphy, on the issue of somebody writing in the name of someone else. And here's what Serapion said: we receive both Peter and the other apostles as Christ. Okay? They understand. They are God's emissaries. We receive them as Christ. But as experienced men, we reject the writings falsely inscribed by their names, since we know that we did not receive such from our fathers. Okay? In other words, that's not part of the canon or the teaching, the inspired, what was recognized as inspired that came down to us. And so even if you had that, it wouldn't have been accepted as authoritative. So for these reasons, you have roughly an even split in modern scholars. Now, if you go over to evangelicals, if you go over to what are called conservative scholars, well, then you have many more. The large majority of them recognize that this is written by Paul. But within scholarship widely, you have about an even split of people saying it's Paul who wrote it, and those opting for this other idea. So, as put by D.A. Carson and Douglas Moo in their introduction to the New Testament, Carson and Moo, they say, it seems then that the arguments against Pauline authorship are not decisive. They do not reckon sufficiently with the fact that a mind like Paul's was capable of adaptation to new situations. Remember, because they say, what drives them off of this? They say, look, the language, the style, the teaching. Okay, well, he's writing to a different circumstance. That's what these guys are talking about. They don't reckon sufficiently with the fact that a mind like Paul's was capable of adaptation to new situations and to adaptations to new situations and to the adoption of new vocabulary and new concepts when older ones do not meet the need. They also failed to give a reason for addressing the letter to the unimportant town of Colossae. Surely an imitator would have selected a city of some importance, such as Laodicea or Hierapolis. In view of the letter's claim and of the many undoubtedly Pauline features it manifests, we should accept it as an authentic Pauline writing. And they continue and say, this is supported by a number of links with Philemon, which almost all scholars take to be a genuine letter of the apostle. In light of such references, it's difficult to argue that Colossians was not written by Paul. And just to give you one other, Andreas Kostenberger, Scott Kellum, and Charles Quarles, in their introduction to the New Testament, they conclude their assessment of the authorship of Colossians this way. When I put that up there, I said, that looks like a law firm, Kostenberger, Kellum, and Quarles. Of course, everybody's favorite law firm is Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe, right? No, yeah, that's right. All right, it says here, the case for authenticity is customarily crafted as a response to the rejection of Paul's authorship. And that's kind of what we just saw with Carson and Moo saying the arguments against it don't stack up. But they say, while these responses are important points to make, one must not adopt a merely defensive approach without advancing the case in positive terms. Paul's authorship primarily rests on the strength of four pillars: the letter's own claim to authenticity, the unbroken tradition throughout church history, the close connections between Colossians and Philemon, a letter which almost all accept as authentic, and the questions surrounding the practice and acceptance of pseudonymity. This idea of are they really... Do we have examples of people in these personal letters pretending to be somebody else or adopting a persona of somebody else? So this leads a large number of scholars to say, no, it's written by Paul. So, Paul it is, okay? I go through this, you say, why don't you just say it's by Paul? I go through this because this is one of these things that you will run into somebody who will treat you like, you say, well, look, you're just an ignoramus. You don't understand what's going on in scholarship, you see. That's all. And so I want to alert you to this. That's not the case, okay? You're informed about what these other people are thinking. But you have good reasons, you have better reasons for understanding that the letter was written by Paul. All right, Paul it is. All right, the city. Now, the city of Colossae, by the way, you'll see Colossae spelled different ways, two primarily. The normal way is Colossae, but sometimes it's just E on the end, okay? That's just different ways of spelling it, so be tuned into that. Now, Colossae, it's a city, it's situated in a territory of Phrygia, in the political province of Asia Minor, which is in that area is what is in southwest of modern Turkey. Okay, so modern Turkey, the southwest part of modern Turkey, that's what we're talking about. And Colossae is on the southern bank of the Lycus River, and it was on an early main road that went from Ephesus, which you see over here. Here's Colossae. This main road went from Ephesus, it's about 120 miles from Ephesus to Colossae. This main road from there over to the Euphrates River. And so it's on that main thoroughfare there. And the site, it was discovered in 1835, but it's never been excavated. Okay, which is interesting. There are all kinds of reasons that go into that, but it's never been excavated. Now, in the 5th century BC, many centuries before, Herodotus called it a great city in Phrygia. And a century later, Xenophon says it's a populous city, wealthy and large. But by Paul's day, in the 1st century, Colossae, it had dropped off considerably in importance. About 50 years before Paul, Strabo, who was a Greek geographer, he referred to Colossae as a small town. And you know how over periods of time, towns are popular, different things happen. So at that point, that's what we had. Now, Laodicea, it's 11 miles to the northwest of Colossae. It had developed into a prosperous city by the 1st century BC. And Hierapolis is 15 miles to the northwest, and it also surpassed Colossae. Now, according to the Roman historian Tacitus, Laodicea, he mentions that city, was destroyed by an earthquake in AD 60 or 61. Okay, this is right when Paul's writing this letter. 60 or 61, but it was quickly rebuilt. And then in the first part of the 4th century, so around 325, Eusebius says that an earthquake devastated not just Laodicea, but he says Laodicea, Hierapolis, and Colossae, but he says that happened around AD 64. Okay, so you have Tacitus who says 60 or 61, Laodicea, earthquake, takes it out, quickly rebuilt. Then centuries later, or in the early 4th century, you have Eusebius saying that 3 of the cities were devastated by an earthquake around AD 64. Now, most people think that Tacitus and Eusebius are referring to the same event, but they just have different information on when did that event occur. However, Janice Anderson, she cites a scholar Alan Cadwallader. She says, quote, "There is no certainty that an earthquake decimated Colossae around 60 through 64. So here's an issue. Well, are either of them right about that? One just mentions Laodicea. Eusebius says that Colossae was involved somehow. But now you have this person saying, look, there's no evidence of that, or that Colossae had faded into obscurity in the late 1st century for other reason. So maybe Colossae was not destroyed at any time in the early 60s. It's just hard to know, particularly because they haven't been able to excavate it. So I just throw that out there for you, just put that, so you know that's up in the air. What earthquake had an effect on Colossae? What was the effect? But it seems pretty clear Laodicea was damaged in 60 to 61 and rebuilt. All right, the people of Colossae. I'll just give you what Douglas Moo says in his commentary. He says, Colossai's location on an important highway at the time of considerable mobility and the mixing of different ethnic groups that typified the Roman Empire meant that the population of Colossae was very diverse. A majority were undoubtedly Gentile, but we have good reason to think there was also a substantial number of Jews. The diversity of population and exposure to the latest ideas via travelers on its major highway meant that Colossae was a place where many different religious and philosophical viewpoints thrived and probably mixed together. That's important for the setting of what's going on here. This diversity helps explain the apparently syncretistic religious movement that was affecting the Colossian Christians and that gave rise to the letter. Syncretistic means mushed together, mixed together. So you have borrowing from different things and kind of cobbling together something different out of different parts. So when you have syncretistic religious movements, you have a religious movement that has then adopted different parts. And that's part of what makes it so hard to get a bead on what's going on in Colossae. Because it seems you have this unique mixture of errors and things. In other words, it's not like, okay, we can clearly identify this heresy from the early church and that's what this seems to be an odd duck. Okay, and it's given people a lot of headaches trying to figure out what it is. Now the church in Colossae, Paul did not personally begin the congregation in Colossae. And you see that in chapter 1 verse 4, chapter 2 verse 1. As far as we know, he never visited the city. Okay, we just have no record of that. And in Acts chapter 19, verses 9 and 10, it indicates that during his third missionary journey, all right, during Paul's daily evangelistic discussions in the hall of Tyrannus in Ephesus, so 120 miles to the west, which went on for 2 years. Okay, Paul's having these evangelistic discussions here, went on for 2 years. They were so effective, it says in Acts 19, that all those in Asia, both Jews and Greeks, heard the word of the Lord. And in fact, Acts chapter 20, verse 31 indicates that Paul continued ministering in Ephesus into the third year. So he wasn't just there for 2 years. But in this lecture hall, he's giving these evangelistic presentations. And what that implies is that Paul's converts, or his co-workers, that they spread the gospel into the interior of Asia Minor from Ephesus. So Paul is preaching in Ephesus, this lecture hall, for 2 years. He's making converts, and they, or Paul's co-workers, are going out from Ephesus into the interior, and they are planting churches and winning converts there. And these church plantings, they fall within the sphere of Paul's apostolic ministry, his ministry to the Gentiles. Right? They are his people who are going out. Paul is the apostle to the Gentiles. They're going out there, even though he was unable to visit all of them. So they are within his sphere of apostolic ministry. They've gone out there. Now the church in Colossae, it was started by Epaphras, as it says in chapter 1, verse 7, who was a native of Colossae. Chapter 4, verse 12. Now Paul describes Epaphras as our beloved fellow slave, who is a faithful minister of Christ on our behalf. Now there is a textual issue. That's chapter 1, verse 7. Is it our behalf or your behalf? Okay, I'm with our. Okay, I'm with our, as are the English Revised, American Standard, Revised Standard, New American Standard Updated, New English Translation, NIV, and the very recent Greek New Testament that was published by Tyndale House at Cambridge. I think that's the better reading. Okay, so he says that he says here that he's faithful minister of Christ on our behalf. And as he says, and as a slave of Christ Jesus, he describes Epaphras that way in chapter 4, verse 12. Now it seems likely from chapter 4, verse 13, that the congregations in Laodicea and Hierapolis, they also were the result of Epaphras' efforts. So Epaphras is quite the guy. All right, he goes out, he plants his church in Colossae. He probably plants the church in Hierapolis and Laodicea. And people wonder, how did the church grow in the early century? You got people like this. See, this is it. I mean, the fire's lit. They're going to tell the world what has happened. Now, Epaphras, he had traveled to where Paul was in prison. You see in 1:7 and 8:4:3 and 4:18. And at some point, he shared in some way in Paul's imprisonment. You see that in Philemon, verse 23, where he refers to him as a fellow prisoner. So he at some point had shared with Paul in his imprisonment, as did Aristarchus, as you see in chapter 4, verse 10. So perhaps they at different times volunteered to share in the apostles' imprisonment in order to be able to help him. We just don't know. How did this come about? Was it so that somebody could say, yes, I will go in and join him for whatever period of time it is so I can be right there and meet whatever needs he has? So perhaps that's what Epaphras did and Aristarchus. They may have done that. For whatever reason, Epaphras is unavailable, or Paul, for whatever reason, doesn't choose Epaphras to be the one to deliver this letter back to Colossians, or to the city of Colossae, even though he's from there. So Paul assigns that job to Tychicus. You see in chapter 4, verse 7, who also was sent with the letter we know as Ephesians. And you see that in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 21. Now, Paul's statements about the group, the Colossian saints there, his statements about them and allusions to their past suggest that the vast majority of them were Gentile converts. The vast majority of them. In the language of Ephesians chapter 2, verse 12, they were those who previously were alienated from the commonwealth of Israel and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. These were Gentiles who had become Christians. Now, Paul mentions Laodicea several times, and the church in that city, in Laodicea, is described some decades later in Revelation chapter 3, 14 to 22, as wealthy. So you have this church here that got wealth. Colossae appears to have continued as a Roman city for centuries based on inscriptions and on coins. But as I indicated, there's some debate about its status and significance in the latter part of the first century. Was it somehow decimated by an earthquake in 64 or earlier, and then it took a long time to recover from that? Or has that been overstated, just not clear? But it did continue for a long time, centuries later. Now, Paul's situation, Paul is, of course, he's in prison, you see in 4:3 and 4:18, and Aristarchus is described as his fellow prisoner in 4:10. And as I've explained, there's a debate about where Paul is imprisoned when he wrote the prison epistles, what we're looking at. So we have Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. Where is Paul in prison? Now, in the class on Ephesians, I gave some of the evidence for believing that Paul is in Rome when he's writing these letters. Now, here all I'm going to say is that I agree with the many scholars who are persuaded that Paul is in Rome. That's the likely place where he is when he's writing Colossians and Philemon. Now, with me on that would be F.F. Bruce, Peter OBrien, Marcus Barton, Helmut Blanke, Donald Guthrie, Douglas Mood, David Garland, Todd Still, and David Powell. So I tell you that it's not odd when I'm telling you I think that's the best place. I'm not the Lone Ranger. Okay, it's not eccentric. Many people recognize that there's good reason for thinking that Paul, that's the imprisonment. He's in Rome, and that makes the most sense to me. Now, if that's right, we accept that Rome is the site of the imprisonment, then this letter is most likely written in the early part of Paul's first Roman imprisonment, so around 60 or 61. Okay, so that's where we are. Paul's in prison. He's incarcerated in Rome. It's 60 or 61, and he's writing to this church, these Christians, a congregation that he did not begin, that perhaps he's never met any of the people there, and he's writing to them there. Now, the situation in Colossae, this is what's perhaps most important for trying to get a bead on the letter. As I noted, Epaphras, who's from Colossae, he had come to visit Paul. Okay, and during his visit, he voluntarily or perhaps involuntarily shared in Paul's imprisonment for a time. Now, Epaphroditus comes to Paul. I have no doubt that he wants, at least in part, to encourage Paul about the progress of the gospel in the Lycus Valley, these congregations and what's going on and how they're, because he knows what that would mean to Paul. He undoubtedly does that, but probably the main purpose of his visit was to seek Paul's advice on how to deal with a false teaching that had arisen in Colossae. And I don't know if you pay attention how often Paul is dealing with false teaching. You see, it's everywhere. And that makes sense, right? Because one of the ways the enemy is going to work is he's going to bring in corruptions of the truth. Okay, so no apology needs to be made when someone teaches and corrects errors and those kinds of things. Paul is always doing it. And so this is what's going on. Epaphras comes. He wants Paul's direction and Paul's insight. He's telling him about this teaching that is around. How deeply it had penetrated, we don't know. But he's telling him about this. Now, there's a lot of debate about the particulars of the Colossian heresy, this false teaching that was there threatening the church in Colossae. What we know about it is a deduction from what Paul says about it. Okay, so we're doing detective work. We're reading what Paul is saying, and we're saying, okay, it looks like he's reacting to this, and so we're piecing together what is the false teaching from what Paul says about it. All right, so that's how this has to go. That's how we do it. And the following appear to be marks of this teaching. It was set forth as a philosophy. You can draw that from chapter 2, verse 8. As a sophisticated system of thought that's rooted in a devotion to inquiry and a love of wisdom. In other words, to be philosophy is to have some altitude. Okay, you see, it's something that we are truth seekers. We are inquirers. And so it's presented that way. It's presented as a kind of insight. And I've said many times, all heresies are packaged as insight. No heresy comes and says, I'm a heresy. It always comes saying, I have greater insight into the truth. This is how it really is. Oh, okay. And so this is part of what they're doing. It's a philosophy. It claimed to be a matter of tradition. In other words, something that has a long, venerable history. This isn't a Johnny-come-lately. You see, it claimed to be a matter of tradition. You see that in two ways. It claiming, suggesting its antiquity, its dignity, and its revelational character. You see, long tradition, like the oral tradition of the Jews, but they said this is from God. You see, it's got deep roots, and that testifies to its legitimacy. As Peter OBrien says, Paul, however, rejects any suggestion of divine origin. This was a human fabrication standing over against the apostolic tradition centered on Christ Jesus as Lord. So Paul rejects that, but that's tied up in this idea of it's a tradition. There was a keen interest in this false teaching in spirit beings. There's a keen interest in that. You see it in 1:16 and 2:10, which probably includes what Paul refers to in chapter 2, verse 8, and in chapter 2, verse 20. He uses the phrase stoicheia tou kosmou, and it's typically translated as elements or elemental spirits of the universe. He probably is referring to these things. That phrase probably means some kind of spirit beings. Okay, there's debate about that, but I think that's probably right. According to Peter OBrien, he says the majority of commentators this century, he's writing at the end of the 20th century in the commentary that I have here. He says the majority of commentators this century, referring to the 20th century, have understood the elements of the universe in Galatians and Colossians as denoting spiritual beings regarded as personal and active in the physical and heavenly elements. I say that to you because when I tell you that, I want you to know I'm not making it up. Okay, this idea of elemental spirits carries this idea. You could say elements of the universe, and I'm thinking about matter and this stuff. That's not it. You can argue that's it, but I would be with the majority of 20th century commentators in telling you that was not correct. Okay, David Powell on the same point. Powell says, in arguing for the understanding at 2.8, seeing that as a reference to spirit beings, he says, in some documents in the tradition of magic and astrology that can be dated as early as the 1st century AD, the term stoicheia was indeed used of personalized spiritual forces that have significant influence over the affairs of day-to-day existence. And there he's quoting Clinton Arnold, who's done a lot of work on this. So I say that so you see that we have some 1st century evidence that the term can apply to such beings. All right, so when we get there, I'll say more about that, but I just wanted you to learn because it's important. These spirit beings play a big role in this heresy, and that's important to grasp. There also were elements in this false teaching of mysticism, the idea of visionary experiences and that kind of stuff. You see in chapter 2, verse 18, asceticism, the harsh treatment of the body and denial. You see that in 2:16, 18, and 2:20 to 23. And there was a strong element of Judaism. You see in chapter 2, verse 11 to 13 and 16 to 17. Now, when you have all of these pieces, various scholars, they emphasize different things in interpreting the marks of the heresy. So you have the data that you have pulled out from what Paul is saying, and then you're trying to say, what matches this? And so you have people who want to emphasize different parts and say, well, okay, it looks like a pagan thing that has been influenced by this, or it's a primarily Jewish thing that has been influenced by this. Okay, so there's a lot of guesswork and speculation because it doesn't match precisely a known heresy. That's what you're dealing with. So Robert Wilson, he says in his commentary, so what is clear is that there are Jewish as well as, quote, Gnostic elements in this false teaching. Now, Gnostic is in quotes because Gnosticism is a phenomenon of the 2nd century and beyond. But you have incipient Gnosticism. You have roots of Gnostic-like ideas and things, you see, that are already there. And so you have Judaism and these things getting mixed in. F.F. Bruce, who's dead now, but he's a well-known scholar and commentator. Bruce says, I always like this, the Colossian heresy was more probably a Phrygian, remember the city of Colossae is in this region of Phrygia. He says it was more probably a Phrygian development in which a local variety of Judaism. So you had a Judaism that had varied somewhat, and you had a lot of variation within Judaism, particularly in the Hellenistic world. Okay, so he says a Phrygian development in which a local variety of Judaism had been fused with a philosophy of non-Jewish origin, an early and simple form of Gnosticism. The synagogues of Phrygia appear to have been peculiarly exposed to the influence of Hellenistic speculation and consequent tendencies to religious syncretism. When the gospel was introduced to the region, a Jewish Hellenistic syncretism would find little difficulty expanding and modifying itself sufficiently to fit the general framework of the Christian story, and the result would be something not unlike the Colossian heresy as we can reconstruct it from Paul's reply to it. So you see that's something that I think is important. And it appears that spirit beings, including angels, that these beings were viewed as intermediaries between heaven and earth. They're viewed as intermediaries there. They somehow were seen to control one's communication with or access to God. So you have, yes, but you have all of these layers of these spirit beings who are at work and are powerful in your communication with and your relationship with God. In order to have fullness with God, in order to have fullness, in order to max out on your relationship with God, one had to placate or appease these spiritual powers. In other words, you had to dance to their tune. You had to satisfy them if you wanted fullness with God. That seems to be what is at work here. Peter OBrien, in his commentary, says, it was a kind of Judaism in which asceticism and mysticism were featured, and where angels and principalities played a prominent role in creation and the giving of the law. They were regarded as controlling the communication between God and man, and so needed to be placated by keeping strict legal observances. Many recent scholars, however, consider that the false teaching which advanced beyond Epaphras' elementary gospel. So you see people saying, no, that was a good start. No, yeah, that's right, Jesus, yeah, Jesus. But if you really want to experience God, let me show you how to do it. You see, let me teach you the real insight that we truth seekers have discovered. You see, and let me show you how you get to, by how you appease these various spiritual powers that are involved in controlling your life and all these effects. We'll show you how to deal with that. Okay, so that's what's going on. It says, many recent scholars, however, consider the false teaching which advanced beyond Epaphras' elementary gospel is to be read against the background of ascetic and mystical forms of Jewish piety, as evidenced, for example, at Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls. So you do have, you see, within Judaism, you have these elements of asceticism and mysticism in different places. All right. It was for a spiritual elite who were being urged to press on in wisdom and knowledge so as to attain true fullness. Self-abasement was a term used by opponents to denote ascetic practices that were effective for receiving visions of heavenly mysteries and participating in mystical experiences. So this is all wrapped up in this kind of hodgepodge of philosophy, religion, like New Agey, we might call it. You see, that was being pitched to the people there. Now, regarding the state of the threat, of the state of the threat that this teaching posed, Todd Still in his commentary says, the tenor and tone of the letter suggests that in writing to the church, Paul was being more proactive than reactive, more preventive than corrective. In Paul's perception, the Colossians had not been sold as far down the river as the Galatians. Right? You remember, you may not remember, but when we studied Galatians, right? I mean, Paul's like, it's a 10-alarm fire. I mean, hey, this is like, I'm telling you, man. He just jumps right into it and starts getting on them. But here you get a little bit more of so it seems like the threat may be a little more removed. He says, nonetheless, he seems genuinely concerned that the Colossians might somehow be deceived and taken captive by a philosophy that certain unnamed others were touting. He is indeed concerned. And he's going to spend the letter addressing this. Now, the relationship to Philemon. Both are written by Paul. They're closely related. Colossians and Philemon are closely related. Both of them are written by Paul from prison. Both of them include Timothy as a sender. Both refer to Epaphras and Archippus. Both include Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke among Paul's companions. And both of them refer to Onesimus. So that's quite a lot of correspondence between them. Philemon is a resident of Colossae, the one to whom Philemon is being written, that letter. He's a resident of Colossae, and we know that because Archippus is in Colossae. We see in Colossians 4:17, and Philemon is in the same place as Archippus. You see that Archippus is in Colossae in Colossians 4:17. Philemon's in the same place as Archippus in Philemon 1 and 2. Tychicus and Onesimus are traveling to Colossae with Paul's letter to the Colossians. And since Onesimus is a slave who ran away from Philemon, right? And he's in Colossae, and they're traveling with this letter to Colossae. They have to be carrying Paul's letter to Philemon also, because there's no way that this runaway slave is going to show back up in the place where his master is if he doesn't have this letter from Paul. You see, so there are a lot of connections between the two, but we'll go on and look at Philemon, Lord willing, after we finish Colossians. But here's what Donald Guthrie says. He says, Philemon's close connection with Colossians makes it virtually certain that the two epistles belong to the same period, and the most probable theory is that Tychicus, accompanied by Onesimus, took them both to Colossae at the same time, that is, during the first Roman imprisonment. And that's what I think is going on. Now, I said we might get to the text. Let's see. Colossians chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. We've got like 30 seconds. All right. Maybe I can at least read it. All right. Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus by the will of God, and Timothy the brother, to the saints in Colossae, the faithful brothers in Christ, grace to you and peace from God our Father. So Paul, as he typically does, he follows the general standard Oriental and Jewish letter form. You know, they're a writing form, like when you're writing a letter, Dear John, right? You see that, you know, this is a letter. So there were letter forms that people, and Paul follows that standard Jewish letter, Oriental or Jewish letter form, but he always adapts it, you see, to his own purpose. And the prescript, typically, it gave the name of the sender, the addressee, and it contained some kind of greeting, like peace be with you. That was a standard form here. Well, you see, that's it. Next week, Lord willing, all that introduction stuff.